Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Lamed Vav. We're going to get started at the bottom with Rabbi Yirmia. At the bottom of Lamed Ham, very last line. Rabbi Yirmia. Ha'amim sheshnehem b'chatat, ha'amim sheshnehem ba'asham. Okay, let's just start with explaining what he's talking about. So he says, if we go back to our Mishnah, we had a case where somebody rented a para, a cow, and then lent it to somebody else. So one is a borrower, one is a renter. So now, if somebody lies falsely under oath, okay, takes an oath falsely, comes Rabbi Yirmia, and he likes to give all sorts of, think about everything, you could say. He says that we could have a situation where both of them lie falsely, and they each have to bring a korban, the same korban. Could be they each have to bring different korbanot. And to understand this, we're going to have to understand what the different korbanot are and when each would be obligated, which one. So first, we're really not going to understand, but let's just, with that background, we're going to say, you could have a case where both the renter and the borrower could have to bring a sin offering. You could also have a case where they could both have to bring a guilt offering. You could have a case where the renter brings a sin offering and the borrower brings a guilt offering. Okay, again, we don't really understand yet what the differences are, so hold on. And then you could have the reverse. How could all these cases be possible? So first they give you the principle behind this whole thing. So what's the difference between a guilt offering and a sin offering? A sin offering is brought when somebody does something, usually someone does something unwittingly. The main point here is that you took an oath, and you took an oath that didn't have financial ramifications. Meaning, you might have said, this happened to the animal. In our case, the animal died in a way that you're not obligated, and you lied, and really the animal died in a different way. So that would be, you would bring a sin offering. When you bring a sham, a guilt offering, when there's actually what we call kfirat mamon, that means I denied a financial obligation. So what really happened is I was obligated to pay, but I lied under oath and I said I wasn't obligated to pay. So now we're going to go through all the scenarios. Before we do that, let me share my screen and let's look at our chart about who is obligated and what. So now we have four possibilities of what can happen. Either the animal was stolen, in which case both the socher and the shoel are obligated, or the animal, right? This is assuming a socher is like a shomer sachal, and they're obligated for theft. If the animal died on its own in natural causes or ne'ensar, some atypical thing happened that was not expected, the socher will be exempt, the renter, but the borrower will be liable. If the animal died while using it for work purposes and it just died in the middle of working, then both of them are exempt. So now the question is, we're going to have four different scenarios. You can see the second chart on the page. What happened? What each one took an oath about, meaning they each lied, okay, and took an oath about something else. Which korban, which sacrifice does the renter bring, and which does the borrower? And that will all be based on the first chart. So, pa'amim sheshnehem b'chatan kigon. So when do they bring both the sin offering? First case, kigon shemeta kedarka, the animal died by natural means, but amrun and but they lied and said that it was beyond their capability, right? It was some unexpected incident that caused the death. Now, socher de ben kach uben kach miftar pater bechatat. So the socher in any case would have been exempt, and therefore it doesn't really matter. So, well, it matters, meaning there's no financial difference between what they said, and therefore they bring a sin offering. Socher de ben kach uben kach, shoel de ben kach uben kach chiyuv mechayev. Now, whether it died kedarka or whether it was netza, right, for both of them, it's the same thing. That's why, in fact, in the chart, I put them together because it's really the same law for each. So since they basically switched their claim to be something that was the same anyway, according to the law, they didn't lie in a way that was going to change the financial situation. And that's why they both bring a sin off. Now we're going to have a case where for both of them, it changed whether they were obligated or exempt. Kigon shenigneva. In other words, both of them really should have been obligated, and they each claimed something that doesn't obligate them. So they said, Meita machmat melacha. I'm sorry, the animal start from the beginning. Kigon shenigniva, it was stolen. And they said, Amru meta machmat malacha, and they claimed it died while working. Now, both of them are exempt if it dies while working, but both are obligated if it was stolen. The travayu kakafre mamona both denied a monetary claim. So they were obligated, but they exempted themselves, and therefore they bring a korban asham. Socher b'chatat v'shoel b'asham. Okay, now we're going to have the renter brings a sin offering, and the borrower brings a guilt offering. Kigon shemeta kedarka v'amru machmat malacha. Right, you already know where this is going. The socher is going to make a claim that it would have been the same either way, and the shoel that's bringing the asham is going to have to change their claim from something that, right, they're going to claim they're exempt, but really they weren't. So Amru, so what happened? Meta kedarka, the animal died by natural means, okay? But this is something, not machmat malacha, this is something that the socher is exempt from, but the shoel is chayav. And that's why, if because they said meta machmat malacha, which is something that they're both exempt from, well, the socher de ben kach mifter pater, he anyway would have been exempt, so therefore chayav b'chatat. Therefore, there's no monetary change, and therefore brings a sin offering. Shoel demchayev b'meta kedarka v'kapater nafshe b'meta machmat malacha, but the shoel is basically making a claim that would have exempted him, and therefore ba'asham he brings a korban asham, the guilt offering, which is for denying a claim, a monetary claim. Socher ba'asham v'shoel b'chata. Now we have the reverse case. Kigon shenigneva, if it were stolen, ve'amru meta kedarka. Now, if it was stolen and they say meta kedarka, this is something the socher, the renter, would have been obligated, but claimed a claim that, in other words, should have been obligated because it was stolen, but claimed that it died in a natural way, which would exempt the socher, the renter, which means bring a korban asham. And so socher hu d'machayve b'gneva v'aveda, because he's liable if it's stolen or lost, kapator nafshe b'meta kedarka, but exempted himself from, because by claiming, right, by lying falsely, therefore ba'asham. But the shoel, the ben kach even b'chay, but the shoel doesn't matter. In both cases, he swore about, took an oath about something, but he was actually liable in both cases. And therefore, even after denying it, he was liable, therefore brings a chatat, a sin offering. Now the Gemara asks the obvious question. Okay, this is quite a complicated, not so complicated, but a bit of a dizzying, which is classic for Rabbi Yirmia, dizzying argument here, or line of thinking, not argument, but dizzying logic here. So my kamashma, what's he trying to tell us by saying this? To which the Gemara says, he wanted to tell us that he disagrees with Rabbi Ami. Because Rabbi Ami said, Kol shvua sha'adayanim mashpi'in ota, ein chayavin aleh mishum shvua bitoy, shenemar, o nefesh ki tishava levatei b'sfatayim, ki tishava me'atzma. Kamash malan de lo ke Rabbi Ami. So what is this saying? Maybe I read a little too much, but Rabbi Ami says the following. Any oath that the court institutes, okay? So court instituted oaths are these oaths, right? They come to court and claim you're exempt from something, right? And the Dayanim say, if you're exempt, you have to take an oath, right? These are oaths. Shvuat pikadon is something the court insists you do. So any oath that the court insists you do, you're actually exempt from a shvuat bitoy, okay? These, for lying falsely, you don't have to bring a sacrifice for this, because it says, o nefesh ki tishaveh livateh b'sfatayim, and they learn ki tishaveh, that ki tishaveh means that comes forward and takes an oath. The assumption is that it's only someone who comes and takes an oath on their own. So the shvuat bitoy is only if you take it on your own. Okay, and therefore, this is, by the way, this is the shvua for, 1 second. Right, this is for the korban chatat. So you're only going to be obligated a sin offering if it's an oath that you took on your own that was a false oath that didn't have any ramifications. But you're not going to take that oath if the court insisted you take the oath. Okay, and therefore, in our case, there's going to be exemptions. I just want to look up one quick thing. Right. Okay, so basically, right. So the point being here is that in all these cases where we said that someone's obligated a korban chatat, it wouldn't, Rabbi Yirmia thinks you are, and Rabbi Ami would think you're not, because there's no korban chatat in these cases where somebody is forced, it's where the court institutes the oath. Now we're going to move on to a new topic. Itma, shomer shemasal the shomer. Okay, and we're going to get back to our Mishnah because that's really what our Mishnah was talking about. But let's pretend we don't know our Mishnah right now. And we have a shomer. I'm supposed to watch something, and I decide, well, let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth is supposed to watch something, and she decides to give it to Naomi to watch instead. Okay, Yael asks Ruth to watch something. Ruth passes it over to Naomi. So Rava mal patur. So now what if something happens to that animal that Ruth gave to Naomi to watch? Now, Ruth was appointed to be the shomeret. But she gave it to Naomi. So who's obligated? Well, Rav Amal Patu. The question is the shomer, the subject of the sentence is the original watcher who passes it on to someone else is actually exempt because there weren't the shomer at the time. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chaya. So now we're going to explain. Amar Abaye, L'tame de Rav. According to Rav, Lo Abaye shomer chinam shemasar l'shomer sachar. We don't mean only if. Okay, now this is Rav. Rav says the first one's exempt. Now, we don't mean only if. Let's say Ruth was only a shomer chinam. She was doing it for free, and she passed it on to Naomi and pays her for it, or somebody's paying Naomi for it. Because now she passed on to someone with more responsibility. So maybe that's why Rav says. But Rabbi says, no, it's not just that case. Ruth was getting paid for this, but Masar l'shomer chinam, but she gives it to Naomi and says, could you watch this? And I'm not going to pay you for it. Can you watch it for free? That she even lowered the level of shmirah expected. And yet, patur, still going to be patur, my timer, to Hamasra the ben dat. This is very clear. Ruth gave it to Naomi. Naomi's just as capable as Ruth. If something were to happen that Ruth would have been exempt for, then, or even, the truth is, even if she's not exempt, right? Yeah, so Rav says, so I should clarify this. Rav says, if you look at Rashi, Rav Amar Patur mikoma shaya niftar im shmara hu atzmo. In other words, Rav basically says, you're going to be exempt from anything you were exempt originally. If you pass it on to this other person, you still remain exempt. Now, this is even if you pass it on to someone who's more responsible, less responsible, it doesn't matter. The point is you gave it to someone else to watch, and it's as if you were watching it. Rabbi Yochanan says, so now let's explain Rabbi Yochanan. Now, if we go back for a minute to Rashi, Rashi says when Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayav no matter what happens, even ba'ones. In other words, if you're a shomer sachar, let's say, you're getting paid, and then you pass it on to somebody else, shomer sachar would be exempt from ones. But if ones happens to this item when Ruth gave it to Naomi, Ruth now becomes obligated. So let's explain why. It's not only if you were a higher level shomer and you gave it to a lower level shomer, and because of that, and you made it worse because you hired someone to do it for free when you were getting paid. But if Naomi was was getting paid for this, and Ruth wasn't, still if Ruth gives it to Naomi, she's at fault. Even though she upped the level of shmirah, still she's going to be chayav for ones. Why is that? To Amar Le, as Yael, who gave Ruth the item, can say that when Ruth comes back and says, listen, I gave it to Naomi, and look, it died unexpectedly. Well, Ruth is going to be obligated. Why? To Amar Le, because Yael can say to her, I gave it to you, I trusted you. I didn't trust Naomi to watch it. Why do you think I gave it to you? I wanted you to watch it. Now that you didn't watch it, it's really your fault. So now, what does it mean it's your fault? Well, you were posher. You did something wrong by passing it on to somebody else. That makes you responsible. I'm a Rav Chisda. So now, before we get in, we're going to see one third opinion after, which agrees with Rabbi Yochanan that you're obligated, but for a different reason. But before we get there, we're going to say that Rav Chisda has a bit of an issue with Rav. He says the following. And not with Rav himself, but the fact that they quote Rav as saying the shomer shemasar the shomer is exempt. He says, Rav never said this explicitly. It was inferred from a situation, and in fact, he's going to claim that it was inferred incorrectly. Dehanugina, there were a bunch of gardeners. Okay, they would always put their hoe with this elderly woman, and she would watch it every day. But one day they gave it to one of the gardeners. Okay, for whatever reason, they didn't give it to her. Shama kala behilula. He heard some noise going on. I think it's like a party going on or some sort of something going on. And he wanted to go there. So what did he do? He gave it to the woman who always watches it. Well, in the meanwhile, he went and it was stolen from her. Now, they came before Rav and Rav exempted him. Now, he should have been exempt for, right? He was watching it for the others. He should have been exempt. He was obviously a shomer chinam. They just say, can you watch this? So he wasn't getting paid, which means he could have been exempt from Geneva. But what was the problem? He gave it to somebody else. So shomer shemasar l'shomer is taking responsibility even for ones. So what do you see here? Rav exempted. So shomer shemasar l'shomer must be exempt. So man dechaza, anyone who saw this situation, savar mishum shomer shemasar l'shomer patul, they thought that's why Rav said it. But beloi shane hatam dechol yomanami inu gufayu gaba da'isafta avu mfakdele. But what's the issue? Mafkadele. What's the issue here? Every day they brought it to this woman. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's whole claim is that a shomer shemasar l'shomer is considered a posheh, someone who's negligent, is because the original person, in this case, it was all the different gardeners together, could say, well, we don't trust that person, right? But in this case, they trusted her because every other day they gave it, all the other days, they would give it to her. So it was obvious they trusted her. So you can't use that claim here. Well, that's why Rav said you're exempt. But if it was a regular case, perhaps Rav would say you're obligated. So we have a bit of an issue with claiming that Rav said that. That's what Rav Chisda said. Yativ Rabbi Ami, so now we're going to bring a question on Rabbi Yochanan. Yochanan says the whole issue is, right, I didn't want my object, anybody else watching it. So you're posheh and therefore obligated. Well, our Mishnah creates a problem for this. So when Rabbi Ami was teaching this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Abba Bar Mama comes and says to him, what are you talking about? What happens in our Mishnah? The renter who's renting a cow lends it to somebody else. Now, what should we say? You should be obligated now and owning that renter. Meta kidarka, and it died a natural death. Yishava hashovel socher shemeta kidarka. All he has to do is take an oath that this is what happened to it. Vashoel, and the borrower mishalem la socher, and the borrower pays the socher. So forget about the fact that he actually gains, but he also doesn't lose. He's not considered a poshel. And if you're right, Rabbi Yochanan, and it says to Rabbi Ami, if Rabbi Yochanan's right and you're right about what he says, why shouldn't you just claim, I didn't want my pikadon in someone else's hands? So, says our Mishnah must be in a case where the original owner agreed that you could borrow the item, that you could give it to somebody else. This is like the main thing that comes into my head is like subletting an apartment. Okay, so basically, the landlord said you could sublet it to whoever you want. It wasn't worried, oh, well, I don't want my apartment in the hands of anybody else, right? Normally, landlords pick who's going to be their tenants. They check, they make sure. But in this case, they trusted the tenant that if they brought someone else to sublet, they would be responsible. And that's why. So now they say, well, if that's the case, if basically the landlord, let's go back to that case, right, gave, or the one renting out the item, gave permission to sublet, then it should be basically that the subletter is coming in place of the tenant, or in this case, the borrower is coming in place of the renter. And then the exchange should be between the borrower and the one renting it out. So, then basically, and this is a good question about subletting. If you sublet your apartment, we actually don't say this, but they're suggesting if the owner said you can sublet, right, you can lend this out to someone, then basically it becomes they're coming in place of the one who rented, and therefore the deal should be between the two of them. And what does the renter have anything to do with this, really? So, and all the more so, right, it's the very weird thing in our Mishnah that they say the borrower pays the one renting. It should be the borrower pays the original owner. So, it's basically a case, and this is what happens with subletting. Someone sublets the apartment, right? This is why I think subletting is very interesting. Imagine you sublet your apartment and then they damage your apartment seriously in a way that you weren't responsible for. Part of your contract was, I'm not responsible for that. So it actually makes sense though that, right? So either they pay you and then you would probably fix it up, right? Spend the money to fix it up for the other person. There's some logic to that. Or maybe they have to take it straight to the original owner, right? Usually when you sublet, it's between you and the one subletting. So you can understand this discussion. Mativ Rami Barcham, second question. So we resolve this question against Rabbi Yochanan because it's not a case of where you could say, oh, I didn't want you to be in anyone else's hands because he got permission. Mativ Rami Barcham, Hamafkid Ma'ot Etzel Chaver. Somebody lends you, asks you to watch their money. You put them in a pouch and you put them over your shoulder, which is easy for people to pickpocket you, right? Because it's behind your back and you're not watching it. Or you gave it to your little kids and you didn't lock the door properly, or you didn't, lock up the money, and you said, oh, be responsible and do this, but they're not responsible people, they're minors. Okay, you're obligated because you didn't do a good job. Tama diktani. Now notice what it says here. If you give it to your children who are minors, but it seems to imply here hagdalim patur. But if you gave it to older children, you'd be exempt. Amai. Why? Why don't we just say, the guy could say, oh, I didn't want your children watching it. Whoa. Why should that be okay? So Rava says, this is not a question. Why? Because moving now to Amabet, everybody knows that when you give something someone to watch, they're going to give it to their children. In other words, they're not home 24/7. Sometimes their kids will be watching, obviously older children, not younger, and that's the whole point. And therefore, this isn't a classic case, and you can't derive from this a difficulty to Rabbi Yochanan. And Amri Nahardia, they even said, we'll further prove this from the language of that source. Daikanami de Katani, it says, O Shemisaran lebeno b'tok tanim. Hayat. Ha lebeno b'tok dolin patur, right? From there you can infer your older children, you'd be exempt. So far, we didn't really add anything yet, but Michlab, from the fact that it specifically said your minor children and not your older children, seems to imply that Michlab de la achirim, it sounds like for other people, loshna gdolim, loshna ktanim chayav. But if you pass it on to some stranger or some other person that's not your child, well, then you'd be obligated no matter what, whether old or young. Otherwise, it would have just said, right, it should have just said if you give it to a minor. Why did it say your minor children? Because it meant only your older children are going to be okay. But anyone else, minor or not minor, you can't give it to them because shomer, the shomer, is obligated because you can't do that. Now, that was two questions we raised in Rabbi Yochanan. Now, as I mentioned, we were going to see another explanation for why we would say a shomer shemasar l'shomer is obligated, but for a different reason than Rabbi Yochanan said. Amar Rava, Hilchata says the halacha is shomer shemasar l'shomer chayav. You are obligated. If you give it to someone else, you take full responsibility. That is the wrong thing to do. But lo mabaya shomer sachar shemasar l'shomer chinam tigru egare l'shmirato. And again, he's going to say, you don't even need to say if you lower the level, meaning Ruth is a shomer sachar, she gets paid, and she gives it to someone to watch for free, to Naomi. Just like we said with Rabbi Yochanan before, even if you up the level of shmirah, you're still going to have a problem. You're still obligated. My timer, what's the reason? This is more of a problem with the oath. When you're a shomer, what happens? If it was stolen from you, you go to court. Let's say you're a shomer chinam, you're watching for free. You go to court and you say, listen, it was stolen. Now, that's a huge leap of faith between the person who gave it to you and you, because you can lie under oath and basically steal their item. So when you go into an agreement with the shomer hires you to watch their item, there has to be trust here. Otherwise, they know that you could take their item and just lie under oath in court. So basically, the reason why, if Ruth passes it to Naomi, it's a problem, is because Yael could say, Ruth, I trusted you in terms of taking an oath. But I didn't trust Naomi. I didn't trust Naomi at all. I don't know her from a hole in the wall. So I don't want to trust her. So I don't want to right? Therefore, what you did was the wrong thing. And therefore, you now assume responsibility. Okay? That's a different perspective. Okay, there's there's some halachic differences between, right? Because in the end, they're saying one and the same thing. So I just want to refresh my memory for a minute. There's something I read that said this well. 1 second. Right. Let's say, here's a good example. In the case of our Mishnah, it's actually a good example because, and this is we're going to get back to, okay? Maybe this is the way to go. In the case of our Mishnah, if you remember, both were there when the incident happened. So they both, the socher, the renter who passed it on to somebody else, actually can take the oath. In that case, Rava would say it's not a problem because the oath is taken by the original shomer. Whereas in a case where they're not there anymore, the socher wasn't there when it happened and can't take an oath about it, then they could say, oh, I didn't want you to give my item to anybody else. I don't trust them to take an oath, and then we'd have an issue. But if they're there and they saw what happened and they're willing to take the oath, then that's fine because Ruth was trusted by Yael and all is good. Okay, that would be an interesting ramification between Rava and Rabbi Yochanan. Itma. Now we see a different machloket, which is going to connect back. So if you have this animal and you weren't supposed to take it out, but you did, you took it to the marsh and then it died in the marsh. So now we're going to have a machloket Abaye and Rava, what the law is. And they each are quoting Raba about what Raba said, each one saying Raba said the opposite. Abaye mishmei de Raba amal chayav. Abaye says in the name of Raba, you're obligated because you took it to a place you shouldn't have taken it. This is what we call, or at least we think right now, tchilato b'pshia vesofo b'ones. You started out, you did something negligent, but in the end, it died in an honest manner. It died kedarka. So, but he says, right, because you took it out to the marsh, or you could say the agam could be the lake. Okay, it's a problem. Rava mishmei de Raba amar patur. Rava says, no, Rava said you're exempt. So let's explain their reasoning. Abaye mishmei de Raba amar chayav. Why? And not only to say chayav, but he's very strong in his opinion. And he says, kol dayana de lo dayan ki aydin alav dayanahu. Any judge who wants to judge any way different than this is not a real judge. Lo mebaye lamanda amar tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones chayav de chayav. Well, I don't even need to tell you that if you hold someone was negligent and then the animal died, though in an honest manner, an unexpected manner, you're obligated. Well, of course you're going to be obligated here because that's this case. But ela afilu lamanda amar patur. But even if you say you're exempt, hacha chayav, you could say that here you're obligated. Why? My timer. Damrina havna da'ag makabla. You could say that the air near this lake, okay, maybe swampy or something, and it had bad air, and the air maybe caused the animal to die. It looked like it died kedarka for natural causes, but no, it probably died from the maybe lack of air there. It wasn't good air to breathe and caused the death. And therefore, Abaye thinks you're obligated because that's pshia, that's your fault for bringing it there. Rava mishmei de Raba amar patur. Why? And not only that, he adds the same thing Abaye says, which is kol dayana de lo dayan ki aydin alav dayanu. And if you're going to judge any way other than this, you are not a true judge, which means nobody could have been a judge in both Rava and Abaye's eyes because each one was going to discredit anyone who rules different. And now he's going to say the reverse of Abaye. Lo mebaye lamanda amar tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones patur de patur. Obviously, if you say that if you started out negligent, but anyway the animal died but honest, well, you're not obligated. So obviously here you're not going to be obligated. But ela afilu lamanda amar chayav. But even if you're going to say you're obligated in that case, hacha patur. In this case, you're going to be exempt. Why? My timer. Because the animal died of natural causes. Da'amrina malach hamavet mali hacha mali hatam. Very famous and important line, right? The malach hamavet is going to get you wherever it gets you. This is the malach hamavet came. The angel of death came and took away the life of that animal. It would have happened if it was in the agam. It would have happened if it was in the house. Doesn't make a difference. Umode Abaye. Now we're going to have each one agrees with the other in a particular case. Di hadra lebeimara umeta de patur. Well, Abaye was all about the hevel, the air in the agam. This sounds by the way like the air inside the bore that we discussed in Bava. Well, if you took it out to the agam and then you brought it back home, well, at that point it died. That's not because of the hevel of the bad air that's near this agam. My time, because you brought it back. So then you're fine. The fact that you took it out and maybe brought it in a place where maybe it could have been endangered But if it died later back in the house, then that's irrelevant and you're going to be exempt. And you can't say because it was there for a little while, it breathed in that air, that's going to cause its death. We don't say that. Rava, and Rava agrees, if someone stole it when it was at the agam, umeta kedarka be ganav, and then it died in the thief's house. This is an interesting one. Dechayav, you're obligated. Why are you obligated? My time. Well, first it got stolen. Now you're obligated for it getting stolen. So if it got stolen when you took it out to the agam, it's your fault it got stolen. Why did it get stolen? Because you took it out, right? You weren't protecting it properly. So that was pshia, that was negligent. It got stolen from there. Later, it died. But what if the Malach HaMavet hadn't killed it? It would have still been stolen, and you'd be obligated for stealing, for the fact that it got stolen. So therefore, and since that happened first, you actually, at that moment, you incurred the penalty and having to pay. The fact the animal's dead now is irrelevant. So Rava will agree in that case you're obligated. Now, Abaye is going to bring a question based on something we learned before. According to you, where you said, well, if it's made to kedarka, then it doesn't matter, right? Wherever it is, would have died anyway. Well, I have a problem with that. Hi de otve Rabbi Abba bar Mama Rabbi Ami vishanele vishanatnulo baalim reshut lahashil. Remember the earlier sugya? What happened? We were questioning Rabbi Yochanan. Abba bar Mama said to Rabbi Ami, you quoted Rabbi Yochanan. I have an issue with that because of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah talks about a case of a socher giving to a shoel, and the socher is exempt. And what did he answer him? It's when the owner gave permission for this to happen. And that resolved the whole thing about the pikadon, right? I don't want my pikadon in someone else's hands. Well, here he allowed it. Why don't you just say, the animal had died kedarka in a natural way. So why wouldn't you just say, this isn't even a question. What's the reason you're exempt? You're exempt because Malach HaMavet got you there. What's the difference if you gave it to the shoel? The Malach HaMavet came. What's the difference if it was with the socher or it was with the shoel? And that's what he should have answered. That's right. That would have precluded the question. Okay. And that this isn't a case of shomer shmasar the shomer because it doesn't matter. So if Rava, you're right, you should have said that. So obviously this Malach HaMavet is not relevant. To which he answers him, Amarle, liditchu dematnitu. Now you have to remember, who's Rava? He's the one who doesn't hold he thinks it's all because of the shvua that Ruth wasn't trusted. Ruth was trusted to take an oath by Yael, but Naomi wasn't. So lididi. So now Rava's going to say like this: lididi da amina ana mehem ali b'shvua. Sorry, I skipped. Sorry, liditchu dimanitu ein ritzoni she'epikdoni biyad acher. According to you, who you think that was the big issue, that we don't want, right, that the owner, Yael, would say to Ruth, I trusted you to watch it. I don't know Naomi. I didn't want her to watch it. I wanted you to watch it. Well, then you could bring our Mishnah, which is an issue because the socher handed it to the shoel and then say, what? I didn't say you could give it to the shoel, and I don't, I didn't want her to watch it. I don't know her at all. But then you can ask the question, but lididi, but to me, and that's why they asked the question there. And then the answer was, this isn't a case of that because they had permission to give it to somebody else, right? They had permission to sublet. So, or subrent in this case. Now, he says, but lididi, but to me, da amina, don't ask me a question, Amin, about this, because I have a whole different way of reading it. Amina, and mehem ali b'shvua, v'hech lo mehem ali b'shvua, lekalot ve'kla. Well, according to me, the issue is that the socher I trusted to take an oath. I didn't trust the shoel to take an oath, but in this case, it doesn't matter because the shoel took an oath. Remember, the shoel was there at the time. So for me, I don't even have a question from the Mishnah because it's obvious. This isn't relevant to shomer shemasar l'shomer because to me, it's all about the oath. And in our case, the socher took an oath. The socher saw what happened. And therefore, there's no question. So that was a difficulty with Rava that he resolves. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Abaye. Matav Rami Barchama. Rami Barchama questions from a Mishnah later on in our Masechet, Daf Tzadi Gimel. He'ela l'rashei tzukim v'nafla. Ein ze ones v'chayav. If you bring an animal to the top of a cliff and it falls, that is not onus. Okay, that makes sense. Why'd you bring it to the top of the cliff and it fell over? And you're obligated. Ha meta kedarka. Now, what's the assumption? What if you put it up to the top of a cliff and it died on its own? Hareza onesu patul, right? Then you would assume, well, that's onus because it died kedarka, and you'd be exempt. Va'amai. Now, according to Abaye, you wouldn't say that because why? Either you'd say tchilato vesofo onus is obligated, or you'd say it's exempt, but remember the hevel in the agam is what killed. So lema le avira dahar katla. You could say it's the air, much thinner air up there, and that caused the animal to die. Or inami, these are things, by the way, we're going to see much later in the 8th chapter, these concepts. Uftsina dahar katla. Having made the animal go up all the way to the top of the mountain, tire the animal out to the extent that that caused its death. And you see here, they're exempt. So, right, in other words, again, it says if you brought it up there, you'd be exempt, which sounds like, and if it fell, you'd be exempt. I'm sorry, if it fell, you'd be obligated, which seemed to imply if you brought it up there and it died on its own, natural causes, you would be exempt. But according to Abaye, you definitely wouldn't be exempt. You would blame it on the air or the exhaustion. To which they answer, you must have brought it up to a space where it had really good grazing, pastures for grazing, and that was permitted because that was a typical place where animals graze. So because of that, you were allowed to bring it there. So then the Gemara says, if you were allowed to bring it there, naflanani, then you should be exempt if it fell. It's not your fault. To which they answer, no. You were supposed to tie it and hold it. In other words, people bring their animals there to graze, but they make sure to have a rope that connects them so that the animal won't fall. Well, then the beginning part of that Mishnah doesn't make sense because the beginning part said, we didn't read this yet. The animal goes up on its own. That's the whole Mishnah. It compares the animal going up on its own to you bringing the animal up. So if the animal went up on its own, you're exempt. That's onus. Well, you should have prevented it. You should have held it back from going up. Then it's your fault. To which they answer, lo tzricha. No, what it means here is if the animal went up on its own, it means you tried to hold it back, but the animal was very strong, broke the rope, and then went up and then fell down. And it wasn't your fault. You tried to prevent it, but you couldn't because the animal was too strong for you. So in the end, we had this machloket between Abaye and Rava. We tried to bring back this earlier, our Mishnah, to try to raise a question on Rava. We resolved it. Then we tried, and Rava resolved it by saying, you're talking in a different person's language and Rabbi Yochanan's language, but I read it through my vision, my way of understanding the sugya, and I don't even have a question then because this case is irrelevant to me. And then we brought this question Abaye with the animal, and he resolved it as well. Amar Rabbi Yossi, last line for today. Right? Rabbi Yossi says, how on earth could the socher get money from the shoel when the socher passes it on to the bar? The renter passes it to the bar. Why does borrower pay the renter? It's kind of he's making money off of someone else's item. To which Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halachak Rabbi Yossi. And in fact, we agree with Rabbi Yossi that the money doesn't go to him. And we'll stop here and get back to this tomorrow. Okay, quick review of what we did. We started with the different permutations and combinations of Rabbi Yirmia as to what kind of scenario could you have where both the socher and the shoel take an oath, but either they both bring a korban chatat, they were both lying in a way that obligated chatat, or an asham, or 1 and 1 in all directions. Then we moved on to, and then we said, why was he telling us all this? He disagrees with Rabbi Ami. Then we brought the shomer machloket by Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, but then we said that Rav really didn't say what Rav said, thought it from some situation that happened, but we read the situation incorrectly according to Rav Chisda. Rabbi Yochanan says it's because I didn't want to give it to anybody else. Rava says the same thing as Rabbi Yochanan, the shomer incurs all the obligations, right? Even onus, remember, but for a different reason, because they're not believed to take an oath to exempt themselves. So they can't exempt themselves by taking the oath. Then we basically went to a different machloket between Abaye and Rava about if the animal if you brought the animal to this agam and then the animal died in a natural way, would you be obligated or not? And each one basically somewhat disconnects it with the honest and says, even if you say the opposite, right, one way, I could still tell you the opposite in this case. And each one proved their point. And then we brought a question against each one and resolved it. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a great day.